Hello everyone. I wanted to give you an extra example of how charitable contributions work for itemized deductions. This has perhaps the most uh, complicated rules with regard to itemized deductions. Remember, itemized deductions became less important with the change in the tax law, which increased the standard deduction substantially, making it such that less people will need to itemize. But charitable contributions is one of those areas that still in the tax law and could be a significant part of a person's tax situation, especially if they're very generous. So we've set up a scenario here that's quite generous. This individual's AGI we're going to keep very low. And this might happen if somebody had, particularly for a particular year, an inheritance or something like that, um, that would not show up in their AGI because, as we learned, gift inheritances are not part of your uh, income, and yet you'd be able to make very generous donations with that money if that's what you so chose. So, in this situation, we have multiple limits, but really the two limits that are important are 30% of AGI and 60% of AGI. And this individual gave a painting of their college they went to for display in their art history building. So this person is an artist. They produced this painting. Uh, it has a fair market value of $12,000. Again, that's substantial. That would have to be established by an appraisal. You couldn't just say my painting is worth this much money and take a deduction for that. But let's say that we were able to obtain that appraisal and it said that the fair market value was $12,000. Our cost would be the cost of producing the painting, which would be the canvas and paints and stuff, which would be very low. Um, so this is going to be, we can assume, is going to be used in the purpose of the organization that they're going to display in their art history building, which means it's part of their education process and such. So we can use the fair market value in this case, but we are limited because this is a donation of something other than cash to 30% of AGI. So the deduction would only be nine thousand. The other 3,000 would be carried forward. Now, if they immediately sold the painting, then we would be in a little bit more difficult situation in that we couldn't use the fair value uh, on this tangible property. Now, we go to the stock of the Salvation Army. We're making a donation of stock. This is an intangible property. This is, you can't touch it. This is stock. Uh, and it has a fair market value of 3,000. This would be subject to the same 3,000, 30% of AGI limit. So we're not going to be able to utilize that at its fair market value. So if this would have been the only deduction, only contribution of property other than cash, then we would be fine. We would have been well underneath our 30% of AGI. But in this case, we already had the other donation, and so we could choose either one, but it wouldn't make, you're going to get 9,000 either way. Some total, you could do this one first and then do six, but between the two, as long as you're going to use a fair market value, it had to add up to 30%, and other rest of it would carry forward, and it would stay that same type of donation. So it would be subject to a 30%. Any excess would be subject to 30% next year as well, and it would go forward in 5 years. So it doesn't come under a different limit just because you carry it forward. So now this one has an alternative that could work, and that is if we use the cost. And remember, this is stock only can use the fair market value if you held it for at least a year. So if it's a short term, you don't want to do the donation with short term stock. Only long term, you have to have held it for a whole year at least. And then you could, in this case, there is exception that says if you reduce it by its gain. So if you were to go back to the cost, you could donate it, and it would not be subject to the 30%. It would be subject to the 60% as long as you use the cost. Okay, so the 60% overall limitation comes into play after you've applied the lower 30%. So once you have the 30% used up, you could still use the 1,000 if you wanted, but yeah, you get it this year, but you would get no carry forward, and there would be, you're losing 2,000 out of your $3,000 deduction. So that would be only in a very specific circumstance where that would make sense. If you and then moving on to the cash to church, because cash is not subject to these smaller limitations, it still would be deductible up to the 60%, which we're still under, because 60% of 30,000 is 18,000. So we haven't reached that limit yet. So while we've reached the 30% limit, then there is that, you might say, another 30% that we could utilize for cash or other deductions, like the one to the Salvation Army where you don't use the fair market value. So issues are, and this comes down to, as it says in your textbook, who you give this to some extent. However, most people don't make substantial donations to organizations that are not what's not considered under the law public charities. Private foundations and some of those things are pretty rare for what you're going to see on a regular tax return. Those are for those with lots of money and assets to give away. And a private foundation is a situation where only a couple people give money to a charity and fund it with their wealth, that then goes and does it what they're going to, their charitable purpose with that money, and doesn't necessarily solicit donations from the public. So those are rare cases and usually don't come up a whole lot. But and again, like I said, not too many people with AGI of 30,000 make these kind of donations in my experience. But that's how the limits apply, and sometimes it's interesting when they apply, especially when someone, for instance, on receiving Social Security and has some business income, and yet makes substantial donations because the Social Security income doesn't show up on their tax return because their income isn't high enough. So their charitable contributions look very high compared to their actual income, and sometimes these limits come into play in that case. So, but I want you to understand the different levels and how they work together. I don't know that was illustrated well in the textbook when you have multiple limits on the same individual.